As a collector of comics, there's nothing more important than making sure my books are organized and well protected. That's why I'm excited to partner with BCW Supplies, the leader in products to protect, store, and display your comics. You can go to their website and grab bags and boards, wall-mounted displays, or, my personal favorite, their art-printed short boxes with designs featuring the Power Rangers, The Walking Dead, even My Little Pony for the kiddos. Just go to comicsaredope.com/supplies and use code BJKicks to save 10% at checkout. That's comicsaredope.com/supplies. Welcome back to Comics Are Dope, the podcast. I'm BJ Kicks, and today I'm excited. It's not every day you get to have a conversation with a 45-year veteran of the comic industry, and it's certainly not every day you get to talk to a writer as esteemed as the legendary Christopher Priest. But I got to do that exactly last week. So today I am presenting to you part one of my 3-hour conversation with Christopher Priest. Of course, he stopped by to promote the upcoming Vampirella issue 666 coming out February 14th from Dynamite Entertainment. You should definitely check that out if you're a Vampirella fan. But this conversation is about so much more. In this first hour, among other things, we talk about just breaking into the industry at 17, what it means for him to have broken barriers in that way, some of his early influences and mentors, how he approaches writing, storytelling, editing, and even some of the challenges that come with a career in comic book writing. Man, we spoke, like I said, for nearly 3 hours, and this was such a generous conversation. This man is a wealth of knowledge, and I think you're going to enjoy. And so, rather than continue to editorialize, I'll go ahead and let you, starting right now. Well, guys, my next guest, right, probably does not need an introduction, and I don't really know how I would start one if I was to try. So, but I'll try, right? So over about 45 years, this man has written or edited on pretty much every major character you could think of, and some you probably never will think of. Um, he's got what's arguably the definitive run on Black Panther. Just as I'm recording this, he just wrapped an excellent series, Superman Lost. And right now we are gearing up toward Vampirella issue 666. And today joining me is writer and editor Christopher Priest. So thanks for being here, man.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's no problem at all. So, this conversation, there's so many places that we can go. And I think we can sort of get rid of the elephant in the room first, right? So we started having this conversation, and for a second, it looked like we were going to be able to do a stream on MLK Day. We kind of missed that, but by the time this goes live, it'll be Black History Month. And what's perhaps a little known fact about you is that you are the first Black person to write a series or edit at either Marvel or DC Comics. And I know it was unbeknownst to you at the time, but all these years removed, what does that mean to you?
Well, interesting enough, when I began this, I guess we have to call it a journey. I was 17 years old. I was in a New York City school system, and they had a high school internship program. I went to a vocational high school that was at the time called the New York School of Printing. I think now it's called the New York School of Media Arts. And they had a journalism program along with like a printing program. So you learned every aspect of journalism, from creating the story to going out and doing reporting. We had press passes where we could actually go, to events and do reporting on things, to writing the story, to writing magazine articles or newspaper articles. And then we'd go downstairs and actually learn how to print them, actually run what was in those days hot press, which meant that you had like lines of type that were cast in lead, in hot lead. So you had these huge machines that could like maim you for life, while you pull these giant handles and create these lines of text that you now set into these galleys. And that's how you made newspapers in those days. And then you shot the plates, and you had these big metal plates, and we learned how to do everything. The only thing we didn't learn how to do was drive the truck to deliver the stuff to the newsstand.
Mm.
And in my senior year at high school, they set up this internship program, and I applied for, I think, 5 or 6 law firms because my mother wanted me to be a lawyer.
Mm.
And I applied for 5 or 6 law firms and Marvel Comics. Because I saw Marvel Comics on there, and I went, well, why not? Um, the thing to understand is that in the 60s and the 70s, um, the world was a very different place. There are people who are today trying to take us back to that place.
Mm.
I hope we don't get to that place anymore, but it was a very different place. And my mother was a single mom raising 2 kids. So mom was always the type of person, bless her heart, who would kind of try to narrow or lower my horizons or my expectations into something that she considered to be viable or workable.
Mm.
So it never occurred to me that I could ever actually work in the industry, that I could actually, for example, when I was 10 years old, I asked my mother for a piano, which was ridiculous because what single mom can afford a piano,
Right.
but maybe like a keyboard. Okay, something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And mom was like, well, no, I'm not going to, do that because it's really expensive and you'll play with it for a week and then you throw it in the closet and you never touch it again.
Mm.
And I think my mother went to her reward. She passed away about a decade ago. I think she went to her reward not knowing that her son plays piano. I stink
Mm.
at it, but I play. I do play piano.
Right.
No, I did not just play once and get rid of it. All through my teenage years, I pursued all that stuff. So certainly, when I was applying to these law firms and so forth, the Marvel thing was kind of a kick. I never thought I would get it. Mainly because my expectations and my horizons were set so low. And I think she did that out of love, but it was kind of a weight and a handicap rather than say, hell, son, you could be anything you want to be.
Mm.
She was just trying to, go, look, the world was not set up for people who look like you to
Right.
be in places and in situations like that. And then you jump ahead, 15 years and, I'm working at DC Comics and I have an office on Broadway and and out my window is the David Letterman Theater downstairs, and
Wow.
I was a teenager interning at Marvel Comics, and they were dumb enough to give me the keys to the place because they didn't have card readers in those days, so you had to have a physical key to
Mm.
come and go, because the way the place was set up, it was a long story, but instead of going around and around to the reception, you could go through the back door if you had a key. So they gave me a key to expedite me getting back and forth and fetching their coffee or doing whatever. But I was 17 years old, I had a key to Marvel Comics. So of course, well, you're 17, you're bringing your girl up there on the weekends,
Right.
so it's date night, it's Saturday night, and I'm like, hey, we got no place else to go. Let's go up to Marvel Comics, and I'm impressing her by showing her around, this place. There wasn't a lot of mischief we could get into because in those days, people practically slept at Marvel Comics.
Right.
So it wouldn't matter whether it was like a Sunday at 9 p.m. or 2 a.m. in the morning. I could go up there and I will find Peter Ledger, who was a brilliant artist.
Mm.
I imagine still is a brilliant artist, and he'd be up there with his airbrush working on Epic Illustrated, or there'd be any number of people in the bullpen with cold pizza, and they're all rushing deadlines or whatever. So it wasn't
Mm.
but yeah, it was a very interesting time, and I had no idea at the time that I was the first black anything, and the significance of that didn't really land until somebody pointed it out to me, and I don't even remember who that was. Someone pointed it out to me much later in
Mm.
my career, maybe even 10 years later. At the time, I was just glad to be there. I loved being there. I can't tell you the love affair I had with 1980s Marvel. We were all kind of a family. It was like the world's worst sitcom ever. Just these kooky characters who were working up there, and I just had the time of my life, and I'm so grateful and so thankful for that opportunity.
Absolutely, man. Man. Yeah, it's crazy to think of just, I don't know. I guess you don't think of yourself as like a Jackie Robinson figure, right? But that just is that way. Um, I don't even know, like, because there's no internet then, right? Is there even like a frame of reference to like what these people who are making the comics look like until you walk into the office?
I don't think so. I think even when I started working there, I was learning as I went along that
Mm,
Keith Pollard was African American. Ron Wilson, I met him, was African American. These were names that I had read in the comic books, and until they walked through the door,
mm,
Trevor Von Eden, and so forth, I had no idea. So I was just a kid in the bullpen, me and John Romita Jr., who was a teenager at the time. And through the door walks Dennis Cowan.
mm,
And Dennis was 17, and he was doing grunt work for an artist named Rich Buckler, a tremendous artist who sadly passed away. And Dennis was his assistant. And he was like, you seem to be a lot cooler than I am. Everybody's a lot. I'm a big nerd, so
mm.
you're a lot cooler than I am. Dennis was really cool. Dennis is still really cool. Okay,
Right.
when you interview Dennis and then you interview me, you go, wow, Dennis, Priest is the nerd guy, and Dennis was the guy who got all the girls, and he can still get all the girls to this day. And so he would kind of come in and we'd kind of get to know each other a little bit, but I had to run around the office making Xeroxes, uh, mainly for Marv Wolfman. I was Xeroxing Tomb of Dracula, these
Mm,
Gene Colan pages, these gorgeous Gene Colan pages. But the book was like 64 pages long, and you had to make copy after copy. They wanted like 20 copies of each book or whatever like that. So I was constantly, it was, oh my God, it's Tomb of Dracula Day. Um, while Dennis had the run of the place, because he wasn't on staff at Marvel, he was working for Rich, so he was just coming and
mm.
going. But while he was there, he'd flirt with all the girls, and I want to flirt with all the girls, but I was the nerdy sweater vest guy, and Xeroxing Tomb of Dracula.
Got it. So you made your way up the ranks at Marvel. By the time, you know, 1984 hits, you're now full editor. And that makes you the first editor I've spoken to on this show. I've spoken to a lot of writers, a lot of artists, but often we as fans don't really get an understanding of what an editor does, right? When we hear the words editor, it's usually followed by like editorial interference, and that's kind of all we get as fans. What is the job of a comic book editor?
Okay, I've always said this, and I've been regarded as kind of as a crackpot for saying it, but
Mm,
I think editor is a misnomer. That
mm,
that's a really bad title, and I think traditionally comics from the 30s to this to now, they've adopted that title because we were printing things on paper and
mm,
running things, and in those days it was newsprint and it was on a web press, just like newspapers. And so they would think, well, the guy who hires the writers and artists and who coordinates their efforts and so forth, well, that person would be called an editor. The problem is editing is the least thing that an editor does. Editing is like the smallest part of their workload.
mm.
What an editor does is an editor is given charge of a franchise. I was given charge of the Spider-Man franchise. Big mistake, by the way. But I was given charge. I was 22 years old, and they handed me the keys to Spider-Man, which was a
Wow.
huge chunk of Marvel's revenue, of
Mm,
their bottom line. So anything that had to do with Spider-Man, you had to come see me.
right.
Okay. And so an editor is usually given charge of a franchise, and their job, her or his job, is to basically maintain and that franchise and generate revenue from that franchise and keep that franchise going. So, like with Star Trek, you have to create the illusion of progress and continuity while not straying too far away that you can't find your way back.
Right.
If you think about it, what an editor is more like a television producer,
Mm,
where a producer is like a showrunner who is, given the keys to this particular franchise, and your job is to generate revenue from that franchise and keep that franchise alive. So, I would rather the industry called us producers
Right.
And for a while, I started like signing things at DC produced by Jim Owsley, and people took that as an ego trip, and that really wasn't what it was about. It was about being more accurate about what I was doing, because editing was just the smallest part of that job. Real quick, just a nod toward editorial interference.
Mm.
Just bear in mind that a lot of times decisions that are made at the editor's desk come from way over the editor's head.
Mm.
When I was an editor, I was working under Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter had very specific ideas about story and art and about, the quality that he wanted from Marvel. Jim Shooter was a guy, as I explained, who wanted to make comics better and have them come out on time.
Right.
And those are two opposing ideas.
Yeah.
You can make them better, but that means a lot of redos and sending stuff back. And he's like a guy who comes to the restaurant and keeps sending the meal back. Now the Jim would send the meal back, but this Jim, because I adopted the name Jim. Okay. My name is Christopher. My name has always been Christopher.
Okay.
My mom called me Chris. My wives called me Chris before they wised up and ran away from me. Everybody in my life called me Chris, except when I went to Marvel. There was a bunch of guys up there named Jim. There was Jim Shooter, and there was Jim Salicrup, Jim Novak. There was a bunch of Jims up there, and I wanted to fit in. So I went, my middle name is James. I'll be a Jim. Okay. So I ended up being a Jim as well. So anyway, Jim Shooter would send the meal back at the restaurant, but Jim Owsley, the editor, I'm the guy who would take the heat for it, because I would not want to go to my creative people and go, well, Jim Shooter is a mean guy and he did this and he did that. I would just go, no, I'm sending it back, even though, it really wasn't my call. So sometimes these decisions come from above the editor's head. Now, skip ahead to today. DC is owned by Discovery Plus, at least this week.
Right.
That changes a lot. Marvel is owned by Disney. And now every script that I write for those two major companies is sent through their standards and practices. So now we have lawyers, and then we have standards and practices people. These are two different sets of people. The lawyers are looking out for, obviously, legal potholes, because everybody is litigious these days. Standards and practices, they're looking for anything that might ding the franchise, because now it's not just you and Spider-Man. Spider-Man's now worth $1.5 billion.
Right.
Okay. So now we got all these people. And so we get, I will get a script approved by, say, Tom Brevoort at Marvel, who is a very powerful guy at Marvel and can pretty much do what he wants at Marvel, except, when the Disney folks send back, he'll send, we were doing a U.S. agent over at Marvel, and U.S. agent, when they asked me to write it, I wrote it the way the character was created by Mark Gruenwald. Right. I knew Mark Gruenwald, is a friend of mine. God bless him. Great guy. But he created this character, U.S. agent, and U.S. agent was kind of a jerk. He was a little reactionary. I want to tread carefully about what I say here, because I don't want to get anybody riled up. But he was kind of over there, right. And he was a little, just a tad racist, So I was writing him as the way I recall Mark writing him. And I worked this all out with Tom, and we worked through the story, and everything was approved, and the script was approved and everything. We got it lettered. The book was ready to go out the door. And then the notes come back from standards and practices, because Disney, Marvel Studios was putting U.S. Agent into the TV series, into the streaming series, Winter Soldier. Right?
Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Falcon and Winter Soldier. So now, okay, we have to be very careful about how we handle U.S. Agent, and U.S. Agent, he really can't be quite that reactionary, right. So, the script would come back, even though it was approved, the book would come back and it would have all these red marks on it. And there's all the stuff that he couldn't say and all these things that we couldn't do. And it becomes very frustrating. So nowadays, when you hear that editorial interference, understand it doesn't always necessarily come from editorial. Right. A lot of times the editors, they want to do the most creative thing that they can do. But a lot of times now, more than ever, it's out of their hands.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, seems the editor is kind of the first creative in the room, right? So yeah,
In a lot of ways. Yeah. Hmm.
it sucks that they have to bear the brunt of that a lot of times.
Yeah.
So speaking of the editor, right? I have been on your website for a little while, right? And you've got your like I guess we'll call it just like your sort of your style guide here from I guess your days at DC. And you are very pointed in what is acceptable, what's not, what makes a good book, what things amuse you, and what things don't. There's clearly a fine line, or maybe it's a really thick line that has to be walked through creativity and then just the business of publishing. How did you balance that then?
Ah, wow. Well, back then it was a whole different story. I mean,
Mm,
today, to give you an example, the style guide was
mm,
created at Marvel because I got tired of saying the same things over and over again. So I thought, well, let me just put it in print.
mm,
Actually, the idea came from there was a bank teller who worked at I think it was called Citibank in those days. It probably
mm,
still is, but Citibank in New York City. And I thought she was really cute. And I wanted to talk to her, but it was like, you go to the bank and the bank is really crowded. And. So anyway, I wrote her this note
mm,
and I went to the bank to do my banking business. And with my, stuff here, I included a note. And it was like the Jim Owsley breaking the ice kit.
mm,
And I gave her like these three multiple choice questions about, and they'll just, I don't remember what the questions were, but just a little
mm,
amusing questions, whatever like that. But basically, I just wanted to can we skip past all of the, because she had the big glass wall and also, can we skip past all that stuff and get
mm.
right to it?
Right.
Can we go out sometime? And it was amusing enough that I got her number,
Okay.
and I thought, well, all right, so let's say Brandon is a new writer, artist coming to work at Marvel, and I realized at some point that Marvel had a lot of procedures and stuff like that. And there was a lot of things that were expected by Jim Shooter in terms of story structure and art and how we approach these things, and I said, well, there really needs to be like a handbook that we give to somebody coming through the door.
Mm,
Somebody gave me a break. I have always and still am been dedicated to, uh, if I can, opening the door for somebody else. So I was really open to new people, and
mm,
a lot of new people came through the door, and this was their first time at Marvel or trying to do something at Marvel. So there was a guy named Peter David, and there
mm,
was a guy named Mark Beecham. There was a guy named Kyle Baker. There was a guy. Uh, uh, there was a couple of other artists, and I'm having a senior moment here, but a couple
mm.
of people who just came through the door,
Right.
and many of them got either their first job or one of their first jobs in my office.
Mm,
And then at DC, there was a young man named Joe Quesada, who came through the door that nobody would give a job to, and I couldn't imagine why. The guy was amazing. Even
mm.
then, he was amazing.
Right.
So every time someone came through the door, and here's Joe Quesada's first job at DC Comics, and I hand him this here. Here's, let's cut through, we can eliminate like, 2 weeks of getting to know you by
Mm,
just going here, read this, and this will give you a leg up on at least how to deal with me, if not how to deal with DC. Now, just anecdotally, DC banned that at some point. One of the administrators at DC got a
mm,
hold of a copy of this, and she said it was much too. She thought that the tone was too abrasive,
mm.
and I tried to explain to her that, like, comics professionals know when you're kidding with them. They understand the difference between real, being a real jerk
Right.
and having that sort of snarky Howard
Mm,
Stern tone,
right.
and that this style guide had been circulated at Marvel, not just by me, but by other editors, by other writers who have passed it on to their assistants or artists
Mm,
that have passed it on to their assistants, and it became notorious at Marvel.
right.
This little style guide here, and people loved it, and they thought it was hilarious. But at DC, at least at that time, and these people no longer work here. So I'm not talking about you, present day DC. I still love you. Please hire me. But at the time, this was the early 90s. DC, the people who were in charge there, they really didn't have much of a sense of humor, right. Which is kind of bad if you're working in this industry. And they really didn't get it. They really didn't get it, and they thought that that the talent were these these gentle flowers, were like these like cream puff type. Who do you think these people are? These people are crazy. Everybody who works in comics is crazy, and we are used to rejection because we get rejection every day. Every day. I've been trying to sell the same story for 20 years. Every day we are used to rejection. I have rhinoceros skin. If you think that this little style guide is going to offend somebody, you're really out of touch. You don't need to be in this business. You don't get it. You don't know who these people are, and how this works. And more to the point, this style guide is already out there in the system. And if we had the internet in 1990, when I came to work at DC, it would have been just everywhere. Right. So anyway, yeah, they tried to stamp it out. So what can I tell you?
Well, it's an awesome thing to still have access to. I think my favorite part of it is the hate list.
Yeah, there's a list of things that I hate. I probably couldn't quote any of them verbatim, but it was just, like slipping the safety off a 38 revolver. It's like, write what you know. You have to be the master of your universe. Before I can type a word, I have some novels that are on Amazon's Kindle store. They're under James Priest because there is a British author named Christopher Priest who sends me hate mail every time I, use that name. So I said, well, if I'm writing a novel, if I'm dipping my toe into his territory, let me use James. So anyway, I wrote this novel. One of the novels where and I just for laughs, I said, you know what? Chapter 1, I'm going to set it on a submarine. Now, okay. When you're writing a comic book or a screenplay, let's say there's a scene where a character walks into an operating theater where the doctors are operating on a patient and they're putting in a chest tube. Okay, so for a screenplay or a comic book, you go interior operating room, bunch of guys standing around the patient doing stuff, right? And they're dressed like this and blah blah blah. And then the dialogue, take that, you rat, whatever thing is. Okay. Now, when you're writing a novel, you have to explain what they're doing.
Right.
So I did have a doctor in one of those novels, and my God, the research was just crazy. And then in one of the novels, the first chapter was set on a submarine, and all of a sudden I had to be Tom Clancy, and it took me almost 2 or 3 months to write just that chapter with the submarine in it, because I had to understand where everybody was on the submarine, what their jobs were, how this stuff worked, and how the stuff worked in 1999 or 1998, because the book was set in 1998. So it's not just how it works today. How did they do it then? And then I wrote a book about a fire marshal, and not only that, I had to study all this fire apparatus and procedures and how all this stuff works, but how did it work in the year 1993, in which the time period in which the novel was set. Right. So, it's just this research intensive nightmare to learn all this stuff. And thank God for the internet, because today it's much easier. Yeah. When I was writing The Unknown Soldier in the 80s, like in the mid or late 80s, I wrote this series called The Unknown Soldier, and that was a historical drama as well. No internet. So I'm getting up late at night, and I'm going to Rutgers University because I used to live in New Jersey. And, this is long before 9/11 or whatever. So they let anybody in, right. And they just thought I was a student or whatever, and I would go down to the library, which was open all night, and just dive into their microfiche. Remember microfiche? Does anybody even use microfiche anymore? And I'm researching all these speeches, President Carter's speeches from the 70s and all the stuff that I needed to do, so it was just, this research nightmare to do some of the things that you want to do and that you want to do accurately.
Right. So bouncing around at Marvel from title to title, you were Larry Hama's assistant, which is amazing, right? Just reading over a lot of your writing in the style guide, you come back to Hama a lot, right? And so I guess one could infer that Hama means a lot to you. But I guess my question is, how do you sum up what Hama means to you and I guess to the industry?
Well, Larry, I tend to think of Larry as like a surrogate father.
Mm,
And he's a guy that I spent a bunch of years, in a room closet with. Our office was very small.
mm,
So, uh, and this was the value of that, was that I would see and hear, more important, hear him sitting with writers and artists and going through the creative process. There were times when like an artist would bring something in and it wasn't quite right. And
mm,
Larry would sit down at his art desk and he'd put a piece of tracing paper over the artist's work, and
mm,
he'd pull out a pencil and go, well, see, this guy's shoulder is not really attached to his arm, and or maybe it'd be better if you did it maybe something like this, or how about if we tried something like that. So I would hear these same speeches
mm,
from Larry over and over and over again. And that's how I learned, just by being in the room with the guy,
mm,
you know. And then uh, Larry is a Japanese American.
mm,
He has very different values. So he has, a kind of Bushido moral code
mm,
that was infectious to a degree. I developed as a teenager. I developed this very strong sense of honor,
mm,
and Larry would say things like, well, you either, you know, like I would want to go and say, look, I want to tell, so and so, either you do right by me or I'm going to quit, and Larry would go, well, no, people will either have honor or they won't. You can't blackmail somebody into doing the right thing. They'll
mm.
either do the right thing or they won't do the right thing. What's important is for you to do the right thing,
Right.
to not get yourself into that type of situation. I can't enumerate how many lessons I've
Mm,
learned from Larry, or the fact that I would parrot those conversations and those values, and even his laugh. I developed his laugh, this sort of maniacal cackle when we found
mm.
things interesting or funny, and I miss him a lot. He's just wonderful. Now, as far as the industry goes, now of course Larry created the version of GI Joe that we know today.
Right.
Um, GI Joe, of course, was a perennial kids' toy,
Mm,
even when I was growing up. But the version that we know of today, I was in the room, when Larry would come in with these sketches or come in
mm.
with these profiles, whatever, and I was seeing this stuff come together, and then we'd get the prototypes back from Mattel, and here's like it's going to look like this, and it's going to have this kung fu grip or whatever the toy was, and things like
Uh,
that. So I would see, this development process, and not fully understand, the implications of it, because I thought,
right.
well, all right, so they'll sell this in 1982, 1983, whenever it was, and that'll be it, and I don't think even Larry understood that it would take on this life of its own, to the point where now there are GI Joe conventions, and
Right.
Larry is a superstar at these GI Joe conventions.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of a phenomenal thing. Then, of course, Wolverine and these other things that he was writing and developing, and that he was a tremendous artist. I used some of his work to in the style guide. I used some of his work to explain why I don't use thought balloons or captions. I also stopped using first person narrative, because that's all anybody does now.
Mm,
I blame Mark Waid for that. I think Frank Miller was probably the best at that first person narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But Mark Waid really locked it in on the Flash when he first took over the Flash. You know, that long run on the Flash.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the thing is, not many people do it as well as Mark does it. But more to the point, I'm so sick and tired of it because it's everywhere. It's all you see, and it's become de rigueur, the standard.
Right.
Uh, but Brandon, this first person narrative stuff is a crutch. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if I can just write a caption, you know, I crept through the dark streets and I was feeling this way, and I really missed my cat. You know, it's much harder to explain that to the reader without the crutch, to
Mm-hmm.
let the pictures tell the story,
Right.
and to make it more like a movie where you're just, you know, I want my comics to read like movies, where I want the pictures to tell the reader what's going on, to inform the reader, and more to the point, I don't want to tell the reader what the character's thinking. I
Mm-hmm.
want to, you know, lay the breadcrumbs here, you know, you know, we'll talk about preaching at some point, but this is what I was taught as a preacher, is to not tell people what you want them to know. Don't tell them, you know, don't tell them what to think. What you
Mm-hmm.
want to do is you want to make your case, lay out your evidence, and you want to build your 3 point sermon or whatever the thing is, you
Right.
know. But you want to plant that seed into the mind of the reader, or in the case of a preacher, into the mind of the hearer, and lead them to draw their own conclusion. And hopefully, it's the conclusion you're trying to lead them to.
Right.
You know, in comics, sometimes it's a split decision where, you know, if I did this right,
Mm-hmm.
like in my Superman book, if I did this right, half of my audience will think one way, and the other half of my audience will think the other way, and they'll get on message boards and argue with each other. And that's
Right.
the best possible outcome, where you have, you know, like this difference of opinion, where like people are now debating to this day what the finale of The Sopranos means, and
Mm-hmm.
what that, you know, I mean, really good writing will invigorate the audience, will get them out of their chair, will get them into the story, get them into your sermon, and lead them to a place where they personalize it, and they decide what the story means. They decide, you know, what is it that you're trying to teach them, or what is it that, in the same chances of in the sense of a sermon, what is it that God is trying to say to me individually,
Right.
you know, through this work, or through this example that this man is that this person has offered from the stage. So that's kind of you know, that's kind of where we're at there.
Yeah. You mentioned really good writing. I heard you mention somewhere else, right, that a really good writer can take a concept that they see somewhere, maybe they read in another book. In your case, it seems to be a lot of film and television, especially television. Um, but you take that concept and you're like, huh, that's pretty good. And you kind of file it away for later. And then you come back, recontextualize it in this case, or in your case, usually in the form of a superhero comic. And it's like that's the mark of a great writer. Um, One, I guess I'm probably butchering this idea. All right, so I'll let you
That's right.
explain
I
it better
butcher
than I
everything. So keep going.
can.
We'll get
But
there.
so my question though is, how do you go about sort of taking inspiration? I feel like preachers do it well anyway, right? Like, oh, I saw this on TV the other day. Let's walk this back. And now, see, Jacob was doing this and that, right? And it all kind of comes together by the end, toward, like you said, that natural conclusion that the reader or the congregant would draw. But how do you go about sort of finding quote unquote inspiration? How do you make the time for so much TV? And how do you keep track of ideas and what's worth coming back to?
Well, believe it or not, I actually don't watch that much TV.
Mm,
I may have at one point.
mm,
Um, I don't know, over the last maybe decade or so, I've kind of strayed away from it, and maybe because I've just been so busy.
mm,
And but I don't know. There's certainly times where, whether it's a good book or whether it's a good film or it's a good TV show, you know, a concept idea, something will occur to you where you go, huh,
mm,
that's kind of interesting. Now, what if I took that and applied it to Vampirella? You
mm,
know, what if we did, you know, The Edge of Tomorrow, the Tom Cruise movie? What if we did something like that with Vampirella? And that's kind of what we're doing. Now, am I ripping off Edge of Tomorrow? No, because it's Edge of Tomorrow is very, very specific about how that plot device works. But it's just kind of like, well, the goal of what we wanted to do was to bring the series, the Vampirella series, all the way back to the beginning of when we arrived, when Aragon Gunduz, my artist, and I, when we arrived. My thinking, my influences my instincts were, I wanted to make the character a fully developed three-dimensional, fully fleshed out, fully realized character, and not just a caricature, and not just an objectified woman in a bathing suit. So I drew my inspiration a lot from the Lena Dunham series Girls that was on HBO. I didn't steal any of her plot ideas or any of her characters. It's just the tone and just the way I went, young people in the city, and the dramatic edge of it is that these are people, young people, they're all striving for identity and they're all striving for a place in the world, and they want community and they want love and they want, purpose and all these other things, and now it just so happens that one of them happens to be a vampire from outer space. Right. Now go discuss. So I thought this would be an interesting way to go. And yes, it was inspired, to a certain degree by that earlier work. So yeah, I think, I don't troll TV shows or streaming shows or films deliberately to say, what can I rip off for a comic book? But if an idea is out there, if I can find a practical application of a concept, I don't think it's necessarily the same thing as, I don't think it's necessarily all that derivative. As far as like just in general terms, inspiration, Denny O'Neil, the late Denny O'Neil, who was another mentor of mine, and another kind of father figure, he used to kind of wander up and down the halls. When I met him the first time, I was Larry's assistant, and we were at Marvel, and there seemed to be this homeless man wandering up and down Marvel's hallways. Now, in those days, anybody could walk into to Marvel. You can't do it that anymore. It's an armed camp. You can't even get upstairs without a full, shield body scan down in the lobby, Right. But in those days, anybody could just walk through the door at Marvel, and anybody did walk through the door at Marvel. So I didn't know who the hell that was. So maybe it's somebody's pal, maybe he's delivering something, maybe he's waiting to pick, maybe he's a courier making it. I didn't, he just this older guy in ragged clothes, and he's pacing back and forth, and at some point I went, he's been here a long time, and now it's like 3 days later, and I'm still seeing this guy just kind of aimlessly wandering up and down the hall. So I finally I turn to Larry and go, who's that guy? And Larry goes, you don't know who that is? And I went, no. He goes, that's Denny O'Neil. And I think I wanted to run out there and just hug him and tackle him. Denny O'Neil was one of my absolute favorite writers and a huge inspiration to me. He's the only comic creator that I ever followed to the extent where I would actually go and camp out at the candy store. We had something called candy stores in those days. And the newspaper distributors would drop ship the comics at the candy store in these bundles that were tied together by wire that would ruin the comics. It was barbaric, right. And they throw them out of the truck onto the street, wow. And that's how you got comics in those days, right? So I'd be sitting outside the candy store waiting for the next issue of Superman because it was written by Denny O'Neil. Flash forward later, 30 years, 35 years, whatever it was later. Oh, maybe like 45 years later. Oh God, I'm so old. Now I'm writing Superman and I'm got my Denny O'Neil hat on when I'm writing Superman, because I'm trying to bring that tone, that tone of realism and so forth that Denny brought to Superman. I'm trying to do the same thing. I go, well, this is the kind of odd man out approach to the character that we haven't seen since Denny was writing it. Right. But anyway, so once I got to know Denny, and at some point I started to work with Denny, not at Marvel, but I worked at Marvel. I wrote Power Man and Iron Fist with him. Then he went over to DC. I started writing Green Lantern at DC, and I would meet Denny on the weekends at his place. He used to live in Greenwich Village. And now he and I together are the homeless guys, and we're walking around Thompson Square Park, and we're just throwing spaghetti at the wall. How about we give Green Lantern a parrot? No, wait, a giraffe. He gets married, and the wife becomes a monkey. Whatever. Inspiration comes from where we can find it, from books, from magazines, from TV, from where we can find it. But mostly it's about pacing around my house, slamming my head into the wall, begging for death. It's a terrible, horrible, unbelievably life-destroying job, because, like just now I was finishing Vampirella 669. My artist is waiting for that script. Ergon has nothing on his board. Ergon has a family. They got bills to pay. The publisher has a schedule to keep. Everybody's going, we need the script, we need the script, we need the script. And I got nothing. Okay. And then I realized, all right, in this issue of Vampirella, thus and so must happen in this issue. And then I realized that in order for me to write this issue, I have to figure out the finale of the previous series. The currently shipping series is called Rage, and it's Vampirella and Dracula, and someone has stolen Vampirella's baby, and it's a whole long story, but it's a very cool story. Right. Very cool book that's out now. But I had not written the finale of Rage, and then I realized before I can write the 669, I went, I got to figure out the finale of Rage. Wait a minute. So it's like, it just, and the clock is ticking, and I'm getting texts, I'm getting ping, 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 Nick Barucci, ping, 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 and I'm just losing my mind. Right. And you're under all this stress, and my friends want to hang out, and it's Christmas, and, and the whole, and I, and I got to constantly tell people, I can't go, because you're stuck in, you try to make these plans. This is a job that's tough on relationships. It's tough on family. You can't plan. You can't anticipate. 40 years ago, I was on my honeymoon, and we're in the Poconos, and we're at one of those tacky places with the heart-shaped tub and the champagne glass, and, and everything's pink, and, it's just, it was her idea, but we're at this crazy place, and I'm there, and she's gorgeous, and she's got the lingerie, and, the whole deal. And at some point, boom, this idea for a Power Man and Iron Fist story popped into my head. And I said, oh, wait a second. And I grabbed my pen, and I took out a cocktail napkin, and I just jotted down real quick, just a couple of notes, give the guy a banana and a giraffe. Boom. Okay, now where were we? And I turned back to her, and she's livid. She's losing her mind. She's like, are you kidding me? We're on our honeymoon. You're always working. You're always doing this. And I had to kind of let her vent. Then I had to look her in the eye, and I had to use the Brandon voice. So, let me explain something to you. And I held up the cocktail napkin. I said, you see this? This is the rent money. Okay. Whatever else we're going to do here, this is what's going to pay for it. Okay. You need to get used to it, because it's like whenever an inspiration happens, it's like gold, and you stop what you're doing. And, there's many times when it's 2:00 in the morning. And in fact, it was just a couple of days ago. It was 2:00, 3:00 in the morning. And I've been working this Rubik's Cube, trying to close this issue of Vampirella. And all of a sudden, the idea popped into my head. I went, oh, that's pretty cool. You know, and the temptation is to jot it down and roll over and go back to sleep. But really, when you get an idea and it's really making you, you know, you got to get up and you got to go write it now. And that would just infuriate the women in my life who would like find me at my computer, or I would have to call them and say, look, I can't go because I haven't solved this problem and I got a deadline, you know, and that's the reality of this business and how hard it is. So, inspiration comes from wherever it comes from, but when it shows up, it's like a blessing from God. It's like a gift. It really is like a gift. And you get off your hind parts and you suck it up and you sit down and you write and you just cancel everything else, because that's the life. What's the line from Godfather 2? This is the life. This is the what is it? This is the occupation that we have chosen. Something like that. There's a great line in there where you go, he's basically saying to Al Pacino, suck it up, get used to it. Right. You know, because you decided that you wanted to be a gangster. I decided at some point I want to be a comic book writer. And that's what it means to be a comic book writer, is that you're on your own a lot of the times, and you're spending every day of your life working that Rubik's Cube. And once you turn in this script, as I just did, I turned in the most recent issue of Vampirella, you know, now I got to start all over again because I'm late on 2 other things and I've got to dive right back in.
And this is the business we've chosen. So a relatively somber note as we end the first arc of our interview. But don't worry, we pick right back up in hour 2. I get to ask about all the priest isms, all the things that you know and love about Priest's writing. I get to ask where they come from, his love of what he calls the keyhole character, how he decides what messages to put in a comic or not, and how he feels it best serves the story. And of course, we just have a lot of fun in hour 2. So I would encourage you to stay tuned for that. Now, if you just can't wait, I do want to let you know the full uncut 3-hour interview is live on YouTube right now for our channel members. So for as little as $1.99, you can become a channel member of Comics Are Dope. It basically makes you a co-producer on all the content that we put up on the channel: unboxings, review videos, interviews, conversations, and you get early access and behind the scenes looks as well. So go to youtube.com/@comicsaredope and click that join button if you just can't wait for part 2 of this interview. And if not, hey, no worries. I'll see you soon. Until then, stay safe, stay awesome, and read something dope today. Peace.